The ballroom sparkled with crystal and champagne, filled with laughter that seemed to echo off the marble walls. Sarah Chan stood frozen at the entrance, clutching a small place card between trembling fingers. Around her, guests in evening gowns and tailored suits clinked glasses and exchanged pleasantries, their voices blending into a symphony of belonging she'd never quite managed to join. "Miss Chen, your table is this way," the server said, his eyes darting away from hers with practiced efficiency. He gestured toward the far corner of the room, where a single folding table sat partially hidden behind an oversized potted fern. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the setup. While every other table seated 8 guests beneath gleaming centerpieces, hers stood alone with a paper tablecloth and a single chair. At her own cousin's wedding, she'd been relegated to the shadows, tucked away like something embarrassing that needed concealing. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the string quartet playing near the dance floor. She began the longest walk of her life, weaving between tables of family members who suddenly found their wine glasses fascinating. Sarah adjusted her simple navy dress with her right hand, the only hand she had. Her left sleeve hung empty, pinned neatly at the shoulder where her arm had been, before the accident that changed everything. The accident. Even now, 15 years later, the memory made her stomach clench. She'd been 8 years old, riding in the back seat during a family road trip. The semi-truck had crossed the median without warning. Her parents died on impact. She'd been trapped in the wreckage for hours, her left arm crushed beyond repair beneath twisted metal and broken dreams. The Thornton family had taken her in afterward. Her mother's distant cousin and his wife had shown up at the hospital with cameras and kind words, presenting themselves as her salvation. The local news had covered it extensively. Local business family opens hearts to orphaned girl. The publicity had been golden for Marcus Thornton's struggling pharmaceutical company, arriving just as a scandal about price gouging threatened to destroy his reputation. But 15 years of living in their house had taught Sarah the difference between charity and love. She'd learned to stay quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to be grateful for the room in the attic and the hand-me-down clothes from her cousin Jennifer. She'd learned that family dinners were for the real family, while she ate later in the kitchen. She'd learned that her college fund went to community college while Jennifer attended an Ivy League school. She'd learned to accept being introduced as the girl we took in at social events. And now, at Jennifer's wedding, she'd learned that even on a day meant for family, she would always be separate, always other, always alone. David Mitchell loosened his tie and pushed his untouched champagne glass away, his attention fixed on the young woman making her way through the crowded ballroom. Something about the set of her shoulders, the careful way she moved as if trying not to disturb the air itself, struck a chord deep in his chest. "Can you believe they actually invited her?" The woman at the adjacent table didn't bother lowering her voice. "After everything Marcus and Patricia did for that girl, you'd think she'd have the grace to decline. It's Jennifer's special day, for heaven's sake." "Oh, come on, Linda," her companion replied with a snort. "We all know why Marcus really took her in. His stock was tanking after that pricing scandal. Taking in a disabled orphan was pure damage control." David's jaw tightened. He watched Sarah reach her isolated table and lower herself into the chair with the careful movements of someone accustomed to making themselves small. Her back remained ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the elaborate ice sculptures and towering floral arrangements she'd never be invited close enough to truly appreciate. "Daddy, you're frowning." The voice in his memory belonged to Emma, his 9-year-old daughter, wise beyond her years in the way children who've experienced loss often are. Just that morning, over pancakes, she'd extracted a promise from him. "Make a friend at the wedding, okay? You're always alone, and Mommy wouldn't want that." Rachel. 4 years gone, and the absence still felt like a missing organ some days. Brain aneurysm at 32. There one moment and gone the next, leaving him with a daughter to raise and a hole in his life nothing seemed to fill. Rachel had possessed this fierce protective instinct for anyone being mistreated. She would have been halfway across this ballroom already. Consequences be damned. The quartet shifted to a slower melody, and David watched as Jennifer glided past Sarah's corner in her designer gown, her expression carefully neutral. But he saw it, the barely concealed satisfaction in her eyes as they swept over her cousin's isolation. That moment of cruelty, so casual yet so deliberate, made his decision for him. David stood. "David, where are you going?" His colleague Margaret grabbed his sleeve. "They're about to serve the entree." "Something I need to do," he said quietly, gently extracting his arm. Each step across that gleaming floor felt weighted with significance. He was acutely aware of the conversations pausing as he passed, the curious eyes tracking his movement. A man in an off-the-rack suit walking away from his assigned place, walking toward the girl everyone had silently agreed to ignore. Sarah didn't look up when a shadow fell across her table. She'd learned early that expecting kindness from well-dressed strangers at fancy parties only led to disappointment. "Excuse me." The voice was gentle, which surprised her enough to raise her eyes. The man standing before her was perhaps 40, with kind brown eyes and graying temples. His suit was nice but not expensive, and his smile carried the weight of someone who understood sadness intimately. "I'm David Mitchell. I work with Marcus at the company." He gestured vaguely toward the head table. "I couldn't help but notice you're sitting alone." "It's fine," Sarah replied, the words automatic after years of practice. "This is where I'm supposed to be." "I know," David said softly, pulling out the empty chair across from her without invitation. "But here's the thing. My daughter Emma, she's 9 years old. This morning she made me promise to make at least one new friend at this wedding. She worries about me being lonely since her mother passed away." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her ears. "Would you do me a huge favor? Would you act like you're with me, just for the reception? You'd really be helping me keep a promise to my little girl." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She searched his face for the trap, for the hidden cruelty that experience had taught her to expect. But all she found was genuine kindness and something else, something that looked like righteous anger on her behalf. "Your daughter," she managed, her voice cracking slightly. "She sounds wonderful. Wiser than her old man most days," David admitted with a smile that transformed his entire face. "So what do you say? My table has an empty seat, and honestly, I could use the company. The accounting department's been discussing tax law for the past 20 minutes, and I think I might actually fall asleep standing up." A surprised laugh escaped her, the first genuine sound of joy she'd made all evening. "I don't know anything about tax law." "Perfect. Neither do they, really. They just pretend." David stood, offering his arm in an old-fashioned gesture. "Shall we?" Sarah stared at his extended elbow. In 15 years with the Thorntons, no one had ever offered their arm to her. They walked ahead, embarrassed by her missing limb, uncomfortable with the reminder of tragedy. "People will stare," she warned quietly. "Let them stare." His voice was steady, certain. Slowly, her hand trembling, she placed it in the crook of his elbow. Together they began walking back across the ballroom, and the whispering started immediately, rippling outward like stones dropped in still water. "Everyone," David announced as they reached his table, pulling out the empty chair beside his own with a flourish. "This is Sarah. Sarah, these are my colleagues from Thornton Pharmaceuticals." Margaret's mouth fell open in shock. James from payroll choked on his wine. But David simply smiled pleasantly, helping Sarah into her seat as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if he hadn't just upended the carefully orchestrated social hierarchy of the event. "David," Margaret hissed, leaning close, "do you know who that is? That's the Thorntons' ward. The one they stuck in a corner to eat alone at her own family member's wedding," David finished calmly, his voice pleasant but with steel underneath. Yes, I noticed. That's why I invited her to sit with us. The table fell into uncomfortable silence. Sarah focused on her empty plate, her cheeks burning. She started to stand. I should go back. I don't want to cause trouble. David's hand covered hers, gentle and warm and steadying. Please stay. You're not causing any trouble. They are. That's when Patricia Thornton arrived in a cloud of expensive perfume and barely contained fury. She descended upon their table like an avenging angel in designer silk, her husband Marcus trailing behind, his face flushed from too much scotch and embarrassment. Sarah. Patricia's voice could have frozen the champagne in everyone's glasses. What exactly do you think you're doing? Every conversation within 30 feet stopped. Even the string quartet seemed to play more quietly, as if the musicians sensed impending drama. Sarah shrank into herself, that well-practiced submission returning instantly. Mrs. Thornton, Mrs. Thornton, David interrupted smoothly, standing and positioning himself slightly between Patricia and Sarah. I'm David Mitchell. I invited Sarah to join our table. Is there a problem? Patricia's perfectly maintained face struggled to express outrage, managing only a slight narrowing of the eyes. This is a family matter, Mr. Mitchell. You don't understand the situation. Then help me understand, David replied evenly. Marcus stepped forward, his words slightly slurred. We took this girl in when she had nowhere else to go. Nobody else wanted her. We fed her, clothed her, paid for her education. Community college, Sarah whispered, but it carried in the sudden silence. While Jennifer went to Princeton, the quiet that followed was deafening. Patricia's composure cracked. How dare you? After everything we've done. After everything you've done? David's calm voice cut through her building tirade. You mean after you took in a traumatized 8-year-old girl not out of love, but because your husband's company needed good PR following a price-gouging scandal? Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone had stopped the quartet entirely. Every eye in the ballroom had turned toward their corner. That's a lie, Marcus sputtered, his face going from red to purple. A damned lie. Is it? An elderly voice cut through the tension. Jennifer's grandmother, Helen, approached with her cane, her eyes blazing with octogenarian fury. Because I remember the headlines quite clearly. Thornton Pharma CEO opens heart and home, right next to articles about families bankrupted by your medication prices. Sarah found her voice then, soft but clear, 15 years of suppressed truth finally spilling out. I wasn't allowed to eat with the family. I had a 9 p.m. curfew while Jennifer could stay out all night. You introduced me as our charity project at the country club. I heard you tell your friends that taking me in was the best business decision Marcus ever made. Her voice grew stronger with each word, years of silence breaking like a dam. You gave me a home but never made me family. You gave me food but never a seat at the table. You gave me shelter but never belonging. You ungrateful little? Patricia stepped forward, but David moved faster, shielding Sarah completely. Finish that sentence, he said quietly, dangerously. Please, give me a reason. Jennifer herself rustled over then, her wedding dress train carried by 2 bridesmaids, her face a mask of cold beauty. Mother, please. People are watching. Good, David said firmly. Let them watch. Let them see how you treat family. Jennifer turned to Sarah, her eyes like chips of ice. You're ruining my wedding. No, Helen interjected, her cane thumping against the floor for emphasis. Your family's cruelty is ruining your wedding. This young woman deserved love, not a 15-year business arrangement. Sarah stood shakily, her whole body trembling. I need air. I'll come with you, David said immediately. Not a question but a statement of fact. They walked out together, leaving behind 200 stunned guests and a family whose carefully constructed image had just shattered like the champagne glass Marcus threw against the wall in impotent fury. The garden terrace was cool and quiet, the sounds of scandal muffled by distance and glass doors. Sarah leaned against the stone railing, her body shaking with suppressed sobs. 15 years, she whispered. 15 years of believing if I was just quiet enough, helpful enough, invisible enough, they might actually love me. David stood beside her, not touching, just present. A solid, steady presence in a world that suddenly felt unmoored. "Tell me about the accident," he said gently. Sarah was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, haltingly, the words came. "It was supposed to be a fun trip. My parents, my little brother, and me. Just a weekend at the lake. Then there was a truck and everything went spinning. I remember screaming, and then nothing. When I woke up, they were gone. All of them. And my arm was—" She gestured at her missing limb. "They said I was lucky to survive. The Thorntons showed up at the hospital 2 days later with photographers," she continued, her voice flat. "Patricia held my hand for the pictures. She didn't touch me again for 6 months after that. I was 8 years old, alone in the world, and they made me feel like I should be grateful just for existing in their house." David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My wife died 4 years ago. Brain aneurysm. 1 minute she was laughing at breakfast, the next she was gone. I know it's not the same as what you went through, but I understand something about loss. About trying to exist in spaces where you don't quite belong, trying to be invisible enough that no one asks you to leave." Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him. "Why did you really come to my table?" "Because I saw someone who needed to know they weren't alone," David replied honestly. "And because something about watching you sit there by yourself reminded me that staying silent in the face of cruelty makes us complicit. My wife, Rachel, she never could stand seeing someone isolated or made to feel less than human. She would have been halfway across that room before I even registered what was happening." "She would be proud of you," Sarah said softly. "I hope so." David smiled sadly. She had this way of seeing people who were trying to disappear and making them feel seen in the best way possible. "She would have liked you." They returned to the reception to find chaos. Half the guests had left in disgust. The other half were clustered in groups, whispering furiously. The Thorntons sat at the head table like ice sculptures, rigid and cold, their perfect facade crumbling around them. But Helen had commandeered the microphone. 57 years of marriage taught me something important," she was saying, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "Family isn't about blood or adoption papers or tax write-offs. It's about choosing to love someone every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." She looked directly at the Thorntons. Some people could stand to learn that lesson. The rest of the reception passed in a surreal blur. David and Sarah danced to one slow song, her single arm wrapped around his neck, his hands steady at her waist, anchoring her. Other guests approached throughout the evening, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of the Thorntons' casual cruelties over the years. "They made their housekeeper wait outside during birthday parties," one woman whispered. "Marcus fired my husband right before Christmas, then bought a yacht," another added. The stories accumulated like evidence in a trial the Thorntons had already lost. At midnight, as the reception finally wound down, Jennifer approached one last time. Her makeup had run, leaving dark streaks down her perfect cheeks. "Are you happy now?" she hissed at Sarah. "You've destroyed everything." "No," Sarah replied quietly, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You destroyed it yourself the day you let them put me at that table alone. I just stopped pretending it was okay." Jennifer's hand raised as if to slap her, but David caught her wrist effortlessly. "Touch her," he said calmly, "and I'll ensure every newspaper in the state runs this story. Think about that before you do something you'll regret." Jennifer yanked free and stormed off, her train dragging behind her like the remnants of her reputation. The next morning, Sarah's phone rang at 6 a.m. Patricia's voice was arctic. "You have 30 days to leave this house. Pack your belongings and get out." The line went dead. Sarah sat on her narrow bed in what had essentially been the servants' quarters of the Thornton mansion and didn't cry. She'd run out of tears somewhere around year 10. Her phone rang again. "I heard," David said without preamble. "Margaret's sister was working coat check last night. Small town, news travels fast." "I'll be fine," Sarah said, trying to sound confident. "I've been saving money from my library job. I can find an apartment. Come stay with us." The words hung in the air like a lifeline tossed to someone drowning. "David, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to. We have a guest room. Emma would love the company. And frankly, so would I. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you deserve better than what you've gotten. Let us be your soft landing." 3 weeks later, David and Emma pulled up to the Thornton mansion in his 10-year-old sedan. Sarah waited on the steps with 2 suitcases and a backpack, her entire life in 3 bags. Patricia watched from an upstairs window, her face a mask of cold fury. Marcus was at his office, hadn't spoken to Sarah since the wedding. But Jennifer stood in the doorway, still in silk pajamas at noon. "You've ruined everything," she said flatly. "Matthew's family is questioning whether I'm like my parents. People are calling us monsters." "No," David said, loading Sarah's suitcases into his trunk. "Your actions made you complicit in their behavior." Sarah just stopped pretending it was acceptable. Emma, who had been quiet in the back seat, suddenly piped up. "Why were you so mean to Miss Sarah?" Jennifer stared at the 9-year-old. "You wouldn't understand." "I'm 9, not stupid," Emma said seriously. "Daddy says family means choosing to love someone every day, even when it's hard. You just chose to be mean instead." Out of the mouths of babes. The drive to David's house was quiet until Emma asked, "Miss Sarah, where's your family?" "They died when I was 8, Sarah said softly. "My mommy died too, when I was 5, Emma said, reaching forward from her booster seat to pat Sarah's shoulder with a small, sticky hand. "But Daddy says the people who love us never really leave. They just love us from farther away now." David met Sarah's eyes in the rearview mirror. She was crying silently, but for the first time in 15 years, they weren't tears of pain. The Mitchell house was modest compared to the Thornton mansion. A 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a yard that needed mowing. But when Sarah walked through the door, she saw what the Thornton mansion with all its marble and crystal had never possessed. Warmth. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator. Photos lined the mantel showing David and Rachel on their wedding day, Emma's first steps, family vacations to the beach. Life lived authentically, not performed for an audience. "Your room's upstairs," David said, carrying her suitcases. "It's not much, but it's perfect," Sarah interrupted, looking at the small space with its quilted bedspread and window overlooking the garden. "It's mine." That first night, she joined them for dinner. Spaghetti with Jared sauce and frozen garlic bread. Emma chattered about school, getting sauce everywhere. David didn't scold her, just laughed and handed her more napkins. Nobody made Sarah eat in another room. Nobody timed her curfew. Nobody introduced her as a charity case. She was simply Sarah. Over the following months, something beautiful began to grow in that modest colonial house. Sarah helped Emma with homework, her patience endless even with math concepts that made no sense to any of them. She cooked dinners when David worked late, slowly learning her way around a kitchen where she was welcome. She told bedtime stories and, slowly, carefully, began to smile without checking first if she was allowed. David found himself looking forward to evenings after Emma went to bed, when he and Sarah would sit on the porch with coffee and talk about books and loss and dreams that had been deferred but not destroyed. About futures that suddenly seemed less lonely for both of them. "I applied to the state university," Sarah told him one evening, 6 months after she'd moved in. "They have a scholarship program for non-traditional students. I want to be a social worker, help kids who've been through trauma." You'll be amazing at it. The Thorntons said I'd never amount to anything without them. The Thorntons were wrong about everything that mattered. She got the scholarship. The day the acceptance letter arrived, Emma made a banner out of construction paper and glitter that said, "Congratulations, Aunt Sarah," and hung it across the living room. They celebrated with pizza and root beer floats, and if Sarah cried into her ice cream, nobody mentioned it. That night, after Emma was asleep, David found Sarah on the porch, the acceptance letter still clutched in her hand. "I never thanked you properly," she said quietly. "Not just for the wedding, but for showing me what real family feels like." David sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You don't need to thank us. You've given us just as much. Emma adores you, and He paused, realizing a truth he'd been avoiding for months. "I hadn't realized how lonely I was until you showed me I wasn't anymore." Their eyes met in the porch light. Sarah reached for his hand, and David took it gently, like it was something precious. "Rachel would have wanted this," he said softly. "She would have wanted us to find happiness again." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked. "Happier than I've been in 4 years." "I love you," she whispered, the words escaping like birds that had been caged too long. "I love you too." They were married 1 year later in the backyard of that same colonial house. Emma served as flower girl, maid of honor, and ring bearer all rolled into one, throwing rose petals with enthusiastic abandon. Margaret from accounting officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Helen, Jennifer's grandmother, sat in the front row beaming like she'd personally orchestrated everything. Maybe she had. The Thorntons weren't invited. David had heard through workplace gossip that their reputation never recovered. Several major clients pulled their contracts after the wedding story circulated. Patricia had been asked to resign from multiple charity boards. Marcus started drinking more heavily, showed up to work less frequently. Jennifer's marriage to Matthew had lasted exactly 7 months before he filed for divorce. But standing in his backyard watching Sarah walk down the aisle in a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair, David didn't think about the Thorntons at all. He thought about Rachel, who would have loved this woman who'd learned to love their daughter as her own. He thought about Emma, who finally had a mother again. He thought about second chances and chosen families and the way love could grow in the most unexpected places. "Do you, David, take Sarah to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Margaret asked, tears streaming down her face. "I do. Do you, Sarah, take David to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." They kissed as Emma threw entire handfuls of petals at them. And if the photos were a little chaotic, that just made them perfect. 12 years later, Emma stood at the podium as valedictorian at her high school graduation. She looked out at the crowd until she found her parents. "When I was 9, she began, "my dad went to a wedding and came home with the woman who would become my mother. He taught me that real love isn't about taking someone in for show. It's about saying, 'Act like you're with me,' and meaning you are with me forever. It's about choosing to stand beside someone when the world tries to make them stand alone." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "My mom lost her arm and her family in an accident when she was 8. She survived 15 years with people who saw her as a publicity opportunity, not a person. But she never let that break her kindness. She became a social worker and has helped hundreds of kids find real homes, not just houses. She taught me that families aren't built from obligation or blood. They're built from choice, the choice to love every single day." David and Sarah sat in the audience, their hands intertwined, his holding hers, the only one she had, but the only one she needed. Their other 2 children, one adopted from the foster system and one biological, sat beside them. Sometimes David thought about that September wedding 14 years ago, when he'd stood up from his assigned seat and walked across a room full of people who thought staying silent was safer than speaking up. He thought about the moment he'd seen Sarah at that table alone and decided that his discomfort at intervening mattered less than her pain at being isolated. One choice. 6 words. Act like you're with me, please. Those 6 words had built a family, saved 2 people from loneliness, given 4 children a home, and proved that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect bloodlines. Love was about showing up. Love was about saying, you belong here, and meaning it. Love was about choosing each other over and over, especially when the world tried to convince you that you weren't worth choosing. The Thorntons had given Sarah shelter but never a home. They'd given her food but never a place at the table. They'd given her an address but never belonging. David had given her 6 words and changed everything. And in return, she'd given him everything too. A second chance at love, a mother for his daughter, a family that grew not from obligation but from the radical act of choosing to care when it would have been easier not to. If you've ever felt alone in a crowded room, if you've ever been told you should be grateful for scraps when you deserved a feast, if you've ever wondered whether you belonged anywhere, remember this story. Remember that sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stand up, walk across the room, and say, "You're with me now," because families aren't built from blood or duty or convenience. They're built from the choice to love, especially when that love challenges the comfortable silence of those who'd rather look away. Everyone deserves someone who will stand up from their assigned seat and say those 6 sacred words, "Act like you're with me, please," and mean it forever.